What actually makes a kitchen senior-friendly? Most people hear that question and immediately think about technology. Maybe a smarter refrigerator, a bigger appliance, some expensive new system that does half the cooking for you. But after looking at the way Japanese kitchens are designed, I think the answer is much simpler. A good kitchen should ask less from your body, less bending, less lifting, less reaching over your head, less walking back and forth for things you use every few minutes, and fewer moments where one awkward movement could turn into an accident. When you're young, most of these things barely register. You bend down to grab a pan from a lower cabinet. You reach up for a bowl. You carry a heavy pot from the counter to the stove. You walk across the kitchen 3 or 4 times while making dinner. None of that feels like a big deal. But as we get older, those tiny movements start to add up. And that's something Japanese kitchen design seems to understand very well. The problem isn't always cooking itself. Sometimes, the real problem is how many unnecessary movements the kitchen asks your body to make just to get through one meal. Think about that for a moment. How many times do you bend while cooking? How often do you lift something heavier than it needs to be? How many times do you stretch for something that's just a little too high? And how many steps do you take simply because 2 things you use together are stored too far apart? Those are small things, but when you repeat them every day, year after year, they stop being small. That's why, as we go through these Japanese kitchen ideas, I want you to watch for 4 things: bending, lifting, reaching, and repeated movement. Almost every design you're about to see removes at least one of them, and that's what I like about this approach. It isn't really about making the kitchen more impressive. It's about making everyday life a little easier on the person using it. Because good design shouldn't force people to work harder around the kitchen. The kitchen should work better around them, and we're going to start with one of the places where that matters most, the cooktop. Because in that part of the kitchen, one small mistake can become a much bigger problem very quickly. Let's start with the cooktop. For a long time, gas was the standard in Japanese kitchens. And if you've cooked with gas before, you already know why people like it. You can see the flame. You can adjust the heat quickly. It feels familiar. But as more households began thinking about safety, induction started to make a lot of sense. The biggest difference is simple. There's no open flame, and that matters more than it may seem. When you're younger, it's easy to assume that kitchen safety is mostly about paying attention. Turn the burner off. Keep towels away from the flame. Don't forget the pan. Be careful. But as people get older, relying on constant attention isn't always the best design strategy. Maybe your reaction time isn't quite as fast as it used to be. Maybe you get distracted for a moment. Maybe you simply don't notice something as quickly. A good kitchen shouldn't punish you for that. That's where induction has a real advantage. By removing the open flame, you remove one major source of risk before anything even happens. And there's another benefit that doesn't get talked about nearly as much: cleaning. A traditional gas cooktop has burners, grates, edges, and small spaces where grease and food can collect. So cleaning often means removing parts, wiping around corners, scrubbing, and putting everything back together. With an induction cooktop, the surface is flat. Something spills, you let the surface cool, wipe it down, and you're usually done. That may sound like a small convenience, but small conveniences matter when they save your hands, your back, and your energy every single day. And this is where the design becomes more interesting than the appliance itself. A lot of people think safety means telling someone to be more careful, but thoughtful design works differently. It tries to remove the hazard before the person has to think about it. That's a much better approach, especially in a kitchen, because the smartest safety feature may be the danger you no longer have to think about. And that's what induction represents here. It's not just a different way to cook, it's preventive design. The kitchen is doing part of the safety work for you, but avoiding danger is only one part of making a kitchen easier to live with as you get older. Another problem happens far more often, sometimes dozens of times in a single day, bending down to reach things. And that's where the next Japanese design gets surprisingly clever. Now think about something you probably do without even noticing. Opening the refrigerator, maybe you reach for some vegetables, a carton of milk, a bottle of sauce. And if what you need happens to be near the bottom, you bend down, look inside, move a few things around, and reach toward the back. For a younger person, that barely feels like work. But do it several times a day, every day, and it starts to tell a different story. That's where the refrigerator drawer comes in. In many Japanese refrigerators, certain compartments pull all the way out toward you. Instead of crouching down and reaching into a deep space, the drawer brings the food closer to your hands. Vegetables are easier to see, frequently used ingredients are easier to reach, and things are much less likely to disappear in the back. It sounds simple, and honestly, it is. But that's exactly why it works. You're not trying to make the person stronger. You're simply removing an unnecessary movement, and one bend may not matter very much, but the small movements we repeat every single day eventually matter a great deal. Think about your knees, your lower back. The effort of crouching down, standing back up, and doing it again later. A good refrigerator drawer quietly reduces that workload without asking you to change the way you cook. The same idea shows up in another part of the Japanese kitchen, the lower cabinets. Traditional deep cabinets can hold a lot of things, but there's a problem. The more they hold, the easier it is for things to disappear. A pot ends up behind another pot. A container gets pushed into a dark corner. A bowl you know you own somehow becomes impossible to find. And suddenly, getting one simple item means kneeling down, moving 3 other things, and reaching your arm all the way into the back. That's where full extension drawers make such a difference. When you open one, the entire drawer slides outward, not halfway, all the way. So instead of peering into a dark cabinet, you can see almost everything at once. Pots, bowls, food containers, cooking tools. Nothing is hiding 6 inches behind something else. And that brings us to another part of accessibility that people don't always think about. Accessibility isn't only about whether you can physically reach something. It's also about whether you can see it immediately. Because when you can see everything, you spend less time searching, less time kneeling, less time moving things out of the way, and less time reaching behind objects just to find the one thing you need. That matters at any age. But it becomes especially important as bending, twisting, and getting back up from a crouched position become less comfortable. There's a simple design idea behind both of these systems. The refrigerator drawer and the full extension cabinet drawer are doing the same basic thing. They're bringing the contents toward you. And once you notice that, you start seeing the kitchen differently. A lot of traditional storage is designed around one assumption. If something is inside the cabinet, the person will figure out how to reach it. Japanese design often flips that idea around. Instead of asking the person to reach deeper into the kitchen, bring the kitchen closer to the person. That one change can remove hundreds of small, awkward movements over time, and those are exactly the movements that become more important as we get older. But reaching and bending aren't the only things that wear you down in a kitchen. Sometimes the hardest part is much simpler. It's standing. Standing while washing, standing while rinsing, standing while cleaning up after a meal. And that's where the next 2 Japanese designs start to make a lot of sense. Now let's talk about something that sounds almost too ordinary to matter: washing dishes. Most of us don't think of it as a demanding job. You stand at the sink, you wash, you rinse, you dry, and then you put everything away. It seems simple enough, but when you do that after every meal, every day, the physical effort starts to add up, especially as you get older. Standing in one place for 20 or 30 minutes can be tiring. Your lower back starts to feel it. Your knees start to feel it. Your hands and wrists are repeating the same motions over and over again. And by the time the dishes are done, you may have used more energy than you expected. That's one reason compact dishwashers make so much sense in Japanese kitchens. Japanese homes are often working with limited space, so the dishwasher doesn't always have to be large. It just has to handle the dishes people use most often. The machine does the repetitive washing, it does the rinsing, and the person using the kitchen spends less time standing at the sink. Now, if you're younger, you may look at a dishwasher and think, that saves me time. And that's true. But for an older person, the benefit can be a little different. It may save energy, and I think that distinction matters, because saving 20 minutes is useful, but saving enough energy to still feel comfortable after dinner may be even more valuable. Maybe that means you still have the energy to take a walk. Maybe you can spend more time with your family, or maybe you simply finish the evening without your back and hands feeling worn out. That's a very different kind of convenience. And right next to the dishwasher idea is another Japanese design that looks almost ridiculously simple: the over-sink dish rack. Instead of washing a dish and carrying it across the kitchen to a separate drying area, the rack sits directly above the sink, so the process becomes incredibly short. Wash, lift, place, done. Any remaining water drips straight back into the sink. There's no separate tray filling up with water, no puddles spreading across the countertop, no carrying wet dishes from one side of the kitchen to the other, and no extra surface being taken up by a bulky drying rack. Again, this isn't high tech. There's nothing dramatic about it, but that's what makes it interesting. A lot of Japanese kitchen efficiency comes from making the distance between two related tasks as short as possible. The sink is where the dish gets washed, so the drying rack goes right above the sink. The next step happens exactly where the previous one ends. That means fewer steps, fewer movements, less cleanup, and less energy spent doing things that don't really need to be done. That may not sound important when you're 30, but when you're 70 or 80, removing 5 unnecessary movements from one task can start to matter, especially when that task happens every single day. And that's really the larger lesson here. A senior-friendly kitchen doesn't only make difficult jobs easier, it removes unnecessary steps between jobs. Because sometimes the best way to reduce effort isn't to make you stronger or faster. It's simply to give you less work to do in the first place. And that same idea becomes even more interesting when Japanese designers look at the tasks families repeat almost every day. One of the clearest examples starts with something very familiar in Japan: rice. Now let's look at something that makes a lot more sense once you understand how often it gets used: rice. In many Japanese households, rice isn't something you cook once in a while. It's part of everyday life. Breakfast, lunch, dinner, sometimes more than once a day. And when a task happens that often, even a small amount of extra effort starts to matter. Think about a large bag of rice. At first, lifting it doesn't seem like much. You pick it up, open the bag, pour some rice into a container, try not to spill it, then measure out what you need. Simple enough. But now imagine doing some version of that again and again for years. That's where the automatic rice dispenser becomes surprisingly useful. Instead of keeping rice in a large bag that has to be lifted and handled repeatedly, the rice stays inside a dedicated storage compartment. When you need some, you place a container underneath, pull a lever, and a measured amount drops out. That's it. No lifting a heavy bag every time. No trying to control the pour, less spilling, less measuring, and fewer small movements that your hands, shoulders, and back have to repeat. It may not sound like a major innovation, and honestly, that's the point. Japanese design often isn't trying to make the most dramatic kitchen task easier. It pays attention to the ordinary task you repeat hundreds of times a year, because that's where small improvements really start to add up. Save one awkward lift once, and it doesn't mean much. Save that same lift every day for years, and suddenly it matters. The same goes for reaching, measuring, cleaning up spills, moving a heavy container from one place to another. Each one is a small thing, but daily life is mostly made up of small things. And that's why this rice dispenser is more interesting than it first appears. It's not really about rice. It's about repetition. Good Japanese design often improves what people do every day, not what they do only occasionally. And that's an important lesson for a senior-friendly kitchen. You don't always need to redesign the hardest task. Sometimes you just need to simplify the task that happens over and over again. A tiny improvement, repeated hundreds of times, can become a meaningful improvement in everyday life. But sometimes the problem isn't the object you're lifting or where it's stored. Sometimes the kitchen itself is working against your body. The counter may be too low or too high. And when that happens, even simple food preparation can become tiring. That brings us to the next idea. Instead of asking the person to adapt to the kitchen, what if the kitchen could adapt to the person? Now we come to one of the most important ideas in a senior-friendly kitchen. The kitchen should fit the person, not the other way around. Think about a standard countertop. It's usually built at one fixed height. And for a lot of people, that works well enough. But well enough changes as the body changes. If the counter is too low, you naturally lean forward. Maybe only a little. But if you spend 20 or 30 minutes preparing vegetables, washing food, or chopping ingredients, that small bend can start to show up in your lower back. If the counter is too high, the problem moves somewhere else. Your shoulders lift. Your arms work harder. Your wrists may stay in an uncomfortable position. And after a while, even simple food preparation can feel more tiring than it should. That's why height-adjustable countertops are such an interesting solution. Instead of forcing every person to work at the same level, the work surface can move to match the user. Raise it, lower it, find the height that feels natural. It sounds like a small adjustment. Sometimes it really is just a few centimeters. But a few centimeters can completely change how your body feels while you work. And that leads to the first rule worth remembering. The person shouldn't have to adapt to the kitchen. The kitchen should adapt to the person. That idea becomes even clearer with another Japanese design, a flush countertop and cooktop. Imagine you've just prepared a large pot of soup. It's heavy, it's hot, and now you need to move it from the preparation area to the stove. In many kitchens, that means lifting the entire pot, even if the distance is only a foot or two. When you're younger, you may not think twice about it. But as grip strength changes, or wrists and shoulders become less comfortable under load, that simple lift becomes more important. So instead of lifting the pot, what if you could slide it? That's exactly what happens when the countertop and cooktop are kept at the same level. The pot moves across a flat surface, from preparation area to cooking area. No unnecessary lifting. No sudden load on the wrists. Less strain on the shoulders, arms, and back. And again, The design itself is not complicated. The clever part is that it changes the movement. That gives us the second rule. Whenever possible, slide instead of lift. And you don't need a completely new Japanese kitchen to understand the value of that idea. You can apply the same thinking in almost any home. Keep heavy pots close to where they're used. Avoid storing heavy cookware above shoulder level. Try to create clear, level paths between preparation and cooking areas. Reduce the number of times something heavy has to leave the counter and be carried by hand. These are small changes, but that's the pattern we keep seeing. A few centimeters here, one less lift there, a shorter reach, a better working height. None of those changes looks dramatic by itself, but repeated day after day, they can remove thousands of uncomfortable movements over time. And that's really what senior-friendly design is about. Not making the kitchen look different, making the body work less. But once the height and movement are right, there's another question that matters just as much. Where should everything be stored? Because not every inch of storage is equally useful. And Japanese designers think very carefully about which items deserve the easiest places to reach. Here's something most kitchens get wrong. They treat every inch of storage as if it has the same value, but it doesn't. Some storage is easy to reach. Some storage makes you bend, some makes you stretch, and some is so awkward that once you put something there, you almost forget you own it. Japanese kitchens tend to think about storage a little differently. A good example is the toe kick drawer. That's the narrow space right down near the floor, underneath the cabinets. In a lot of kitchens, that space does absolutely nothing. It's just there. But in some Japanese kitchens, it becomes a shallow, hidden drawer. Now, at first, you might think, wait a minute, isn't that too low for an older person? And that's a fair question, because the point is not to put everyday items down there. You probably don't want your favorite frying pan, your daily dishes, or anything heavy stored near the floor. That would defeat the whole purpose. The smarter use is for things you don't need very often. Baking trays, extra kitchen towels, seasonal serving pieces, lightweight equipment that only comes out once in a while. That way, the low, less convenient space handles the low-priority items, and the more comfortable storage areas can be saved for the things you use every single day. That leads to a simple idea that can make almost any kitchen easier to use. The easiest to reach space should be reserved for the things you use most. Think about the area between your waist and your shoulders. For most people, that's the easiest zone to work in. You don't have to crouch. You don't have to stretch. You don't have to balance on your toes. So, why waste that space on something you use twice a year? Keep the coffee mug you use every morning there. Keep the plates you use every day there. Keep the pan you reach for 3 times a week there. And move the rarely used things somewhere else. That may sound obvious, but a lot of kitchens are organized by where something happens to fit, not by how often it gets used. And that makes daily life harder than it needs to be. The same problem shows up in corner cabinets. If you have one, you probably know what I mean. They look like they should hold a lot, and technically, they do. But the back corner can feel like another country. You put a pot in there, then another pot goes in front of it. A few months later, you're on your knees, reaching into a dark cabinet, wondering where that first pot went. This is where a rotating corner shelf earns its place. Instead of reaching deep into the cabinet, you turn the shelf, and the contents come toward you. The thing that was hidden in the back is suddenly right in front. No crawling, no deep reaching, no pulling out 5 other things first. And that teaches us something important about storage. More storage is not always better. Because more space doesn't help much if your body can't comfortably use it. A cabinet can be huge and still be inconvenient. A smaller storage area can be far more useful if everything inside it is easy to see and easy to reach. That's the difference between storage capacity and usable storage. And for a senior-friendly kitchen, usable storage matters much more. The goal isn't to squeeze the maximum number of things into the kitchen. The goal is to make the things you actually need easy to access. That's a very different way of thinking. And once you start organizing a kitchen around frequency and reach, the whole room becomes easier to live with. But Japanese kitchens don't stop at organizing where objects go. They also pay attention to how people move while cooking, because sometimes the smartest improvement isn't about storage at all. It's about removing a few unnecessary steps. Here's another thing Japanese kitchens tend to do very well. They don't just think about where things are stored, they think about what happens between one task and the next. And that matters more than it sounds. Take food prep. You're chopping vegetables. You trim an onion, peel a carrot, open a package. Now you have scraps in your hand. In a lot of kitchens, the trash can is somewhere across the room, so you stop what you're doing, turn around, walk over, throw everything away, then walk back and start again. Once or twice, that doesn't seem like much, but during a full meal, you may repeat that little trip over and over again. That's why a pull-out trash cabinet can make such a difference. In many Japanese kitchens, the trash bin is built directly beneath or beside the preparation area. So the workflow becomes very simple. Cut, pull, drop, continue. That's it. The waste goes away exactly where it's created. You don't have to carry scraps across the kitchen. You don't have to keep turning around. You don't need another object sitting in the middle of the floor. And the trash stays hidden when you're not using it. Again, none of this is dramatic, but that's exactly the point. A good workflow removes friction before you even notice it. Every extra step you eliminate is one less step your knees have to take, one less turn for your back, one less interruption in the middle of a task. For a younger person, that may simply feel efficient. For an older person, it can make the whole cooking process feel less tiring. And there's another Japanese storage idea that works in a very different way. The floor storage hatch. This one surprises a lot of people outside Japan. In some homes, a section of the kitchen floor lifts up to reveal storage underneath. At first, that might not sound especially senior-friendly. After all, if the goal is less bending, why would you put storage in the floor? And that's exactly why the way you use it matters. The floor hatch should not become the place where you keep things you reach for every day. That would make daily life harder, not easier. Its real value is for bulky or rarely used items. Large serving dishes, seasonal kitchen equipment, extra supplies, things you may need, but not very often. By moving those items into a less convenient storage area, you free up the better storage zones for the things that actually matter every day. Your daily pots can stay higher. Your plates can stay within comfortable reach. Your most used ingredients don't have to compete with something you only touch twice a year. So the senior-friendly benefit of floor storage is indirect. It's not about making the floor easier to reach. It's about keeping the easiest to reach places available for everyday life. And once you start thinking this way, you realize something important. A well-designed kitchen isn't organized only by category. It's organized by movement. Where does the task begin? What happens next? What do you need most often? How far do you have to walk? How often do you have to bend? How many times do you have to turn around? Those are the questions that shape a kitchen that feels easy to use. And that leads to one of the strongest ideas in this whole video. The best kitchens don't just organize objects well, they organize movement well. Because a kitchen can have beautiful cabinets and plenty of storage and still make your body work much harder than necessary. But when the workflow is right, everything starts to feel smoother. You prepare, you reach, you discard, you continue, with fewer interruptions in between. And there's one place where this kind of thinking becomes even more important: above shoulder level. Because once everyday storage forces someone to stretch, stand on tiptoes, or climb onto a chair, convenience can turn into a genuine safety problem. And that's where the next Japanese designs become especially thoughtful. Now let's move to one of the most difficult parts of the kitchen as we get older: the space above our shoulders. Upper cabinets are useful. They give you more storage without taking up floor space. But they come with a trade-off. The higher something is, the harder your body has to work to reach it. And at some point, that extra reach stops being inconvenient. It starts becoming risky. One Japanese solution is the lift-down drying rack. It's usually installed above the sink. Instead of asking you to reach up every time you want to put away a plate or cup, the rack can be pulled down toward you. So, after washing a dish, you don't have to stretch overhead. You don't have to carry it somewhere else. You don't need to clutter the counter with a separate drying rack. The washing, drying, and storage all stay around the same work zone. And once you notice that, the design makes a lot of sense. Wash, lower the rack, place the dish, raise it back up. Done. It's not only about making the shelf easier to reach. It's about keeping the whole task compact. The sink is here. The drying space is right above it. The next step happens where the previous one ends. That means less reaching, less carrying, and less unnecessary movement. But the next design takes the same idea and applies it to something even more important: upper storage cabinets. In a normal kitchen, upper cabinets can become difficult to use over time. You reach, stretch, stand on your toes, and if something is just a little too high, there's always that temptation to grab a chair. That may not feel dangerous when you're younger, but as balance changes, one small climb can become a much bigger risk. Japanese pull-down storage systems solve that problem in a very simple way. Instead of making you go up to the shelf comes down to you. You pull a handle, the entire storage section lowers toward eye level or hand level. Now the bowls are right in front of you. The plates are easier to see, the containers are easier to reach, and there's no need to stretch your body into an awkward position. No standing on tiptoes, no balancing, no chair. That last part matters more than it sounds, because a pull-down shelf may look like a small convenience, maybe even a luxury. But imagine a 78-year-old person who still enjoys making breakfast every morning. Their favorite bowl is stored in the upper cabinet. Without this system, reaching it might mean standing on a chair. With the pull-down shelf, they simply pull the handle. The bowl comes to them. That changes the meaning of the design. It's no longer just about storage. It's about independence. Being able to make your own breakfast, choose your own dishes, prepare your own food, without having to ask someone else to reach something for you. Those small moments are easy to overlook, but they're part of what allows people to keep living on their own terms. And that's why this may be one of the most thoughtful designs in the entire kitchen. Sometimes the most important design isn't the one that helps you do more. It's the one that prevents one dangerous movement. One climb you didn't have to make. One stretch you didn't have to risk. One moment where the kitchen quietly made the safer choice easier. And when you step back and look at all 14 of these Japanese kitchen ideas together, something becomes very clear. They aren't 14 unrelated gadgets. They're all following the same larger philosophy. And once you see that pattern, you can start applying it to almost any kitchen. When you step back and look at all 14 of these ideas together, something becomes pretty clear. The real lesson isn't about buying 14 different products. It isn't even really about having a Japanese kitchen. It's about the way the kitchen is designed around the person using it. And if I had to boil the whole thing down, I'd say there are 5 rules worth remembering. The first is simple. Bring things to the person. That's what the refrigerator drawers do. It's what full extension drawers do. It's what rotating corner shelves and pull-down cabinets do. Instead of asking someone to bend farther, reach deeper, or stretch higher, the storage moves closer to them. That changes the question from, "Can I still reach that?" to, "Can the kitchen bring it to me?" The second rule is just as practical. Whenever possible, slide instead of lift. A heavy pot doesn't always need to be picked up. If the work surface and the cooktop are level, you can often slide it instead. That saves the wrists, the shoulders, the back. And it removes one more unnecessary strain from something you may do every day. The third rule is about where things belong. Save the easiest to reach spaces for the things you use most. Your everyday dishes should not be stored where you have to climb for them. Your heaviest pot should not be above your head, and something you use twice a year should not occupy the most comfortable cabinet in the kitchen. The easiest storage should go to the most important daily items. That sounds obvious, but if you look around your own kitchen, you may be surprised by how often we do the opposite. The fourth rule is to reduce repeated movement. This may be the quietest idea in the whole video, but I think it may be one of the most important. One extra step doesn't matter much. One extra bend doesn't matter much. One unnecessary trip across the kitchen doesn't matter much until you do it 10 times a day, then hundreds of times a year. That's why the trash bin belongs near the preparation area, why the drying rack works so well above the sink, why frequently used items should stay close to where they're used. A good kitchen doesn't just make one big task easier. It removes dozens of tiny tasks you never needed in the first place. And the fifth rule may matter most of all. Design out the hazard before it becomes an accident. A safer cooktop. A shelf that comes down instead of making you climb up. A clear floor instead of a trash can sitting in the walkway. Good safety design doesn't depend entirely on remembering to be careful every single time. It makes the safer choice the easier choice. Now, here's the part I think is worth remembering. You do not need to tear out your kitchen and start over to use any of these ideas. You can make small changes. Move heavy pots from upper cabinets to around waist height. Put the dishes you use every day closer to the sink. Move rarely used appliances farther away. Keep the trash closer to the place where you prepare food. And if you need a chair or stool to reach something you use every day, that item probably belongs somewhere else. None of those changes is dramatic. Most of them cost very little. Some cost nothing. But they all follow the same principle. Make the kitchen ask less from your body. And I think that matters because cooking is about more than food. For a lot of older adults, making breakfast for yourself means something. Brewing your own tea means something. Preparing the meal you've made for years means something. Being able to walk into your own kitchen and cook without asking someone else for help means something. Those ordinary routines are part of independence. And that's easy to forget when we talk about kitchen design. We tend to focus on countertops, cabinets, appliances, storage. But underneath all of that, the real question is much simpler. Can this kitchen keep working for the person as that person gets older? Because for many older adults, the goal isn't to cook faster, it's to keep cooking at all. The best kitchen may not be the one that helps you prepare dinner 5 minutes faster. It may be the one that lets you keep preparing dinner for 5, 10, or even 20 more years. And maybe that's the most thoughtful thing about these Japanese kitchens. They aren't designed around appliances. They're designed around people. And maybe that's the real lesson here. A better kitchen doesn't have to be bigger, more expensive, or filled with the latest technology. Sometimes the best improvements are the ones that quietly remove a little strain from everyday life. One less bend, one less heavy lift, one less dangerous reach, one less reason to ask for help. And over time, those small changes can mean something much bigger: more comfort, more confidence, and more independence. So take a look at your own kitchen. What's one thing you could move, lower, simplify, or reorganize to make everyday cooking easier? Let me know in the comments. I'd really like to hear which of these Japanese kitchen ideas you would actually use in your own home. And if you enjoy practical ideas from Japanese homes that make everyday life simpler, safer, and more comfortable, consider subscribing. There are a lot more small design choices like these that are easy to miss, but once you notice them, you start seeing your home very differently. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.